Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Kirk, and I direct the Center for Law and the Human Person at the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law. I want to add my thanks to the organizers of this symposium and to each of you for making time over the last couple of days to celebrate Making Men Moral and for contributing to the conversation about it. Before we get started, if I might just say, as one of the people here, maybe one of the few people here who did not have the good fortune of being a protege or a mentee of Professor George, I want to acknowledge how beautiful this symposium is, not just the edifying conversations about the book and its arguments and its legacy, but also as a testament to the beautiful role, the important role that a teacher and mentor can play in the life of his students. A couple of years ago, I had the occasion to write an essay honoring one of my mentors, another natural law scholar, Charlie Rice. And in it, I lamented the decline of mentorship, which, is one of those institutions that strengthens civil society and helps to make men moral, right? And so not only does a mentor guide a young person through vocational decisions, but also helps to strengthen their character and fosters flourishing of the whole person. So the relationship that I've been able to observe and witness over these last couple of days between Professor George and his students is a really powerful witness to the importance of encountering intellectual formation within community and friendship, that cor ad cor loquitur. So it's incredibly inspiring to me, and I think to everybody here who interacts with young people. So to our panel, in some important sense, the topic of this panel, civil liberties or public morality, is really the heart of the contemporary debate about making men moral. And the panelists, I think you'll see, are exceptional, each of them a protege of Professor George and scholar in his or her own right. So let me briefly, if I can, introduce each of the speakers in the order they will speak. So first, Professor Melissa Moskela is an associate professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of America, where her teaching and research focus on natural law, biomedical ethics, and the moral and political status of the family. Her book, To Whom Do Children Belong? Parental Rights, Civic Education, and Children's Autonomy, was published in 2016 by Cambridge University Press. And her forthcoming second book, Human Flourishing, A Natural Law Account of Ethics and Politics, lays out the natural law view that is at the foundation of making men moral, and includes a defense of limited government, civil liberties, and the rule of law that is so deeply indebted to Professor George's work. She graduated magna cum laude from Harvard, received a licentiate in philosophy summa cum laude from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, and received her PhD in political philosophy from Princeton. Second, at the far end, Daniel Mark is an assistant professor of political science at Villanova, where he has taught since 2013. There he teaches political theory, philosophy of law, American political thought, and politics and religion. His book, The Nature of Law, Authority, Obligation, and the Common Good, is forthcoming with Notre Dame Press. He holds a BA, magna cum laude, MA, and PhD from the Department of Politics at Princeton University, and he wrote his dissertation under the direction of Professor Robert George. His affiliations and accomplishments are too numerous to count, so I'll just mention the ones in his bio that intrigued me. He served for 4 years on the 9-member Bipartisan Commission on International Religious Freedom. He holds the rank of battalion professor in Villanova's Navy Reserve's Officer Training Corps. He serves as the faculty advisor to the mock trial team and the men's lacrosse team. And before graduate school, he spent 4 years as a high school teacher in New York City. Finally, right here to my immediate right, Sharif Girgis is an associate professor of law at Notre Dame Law School. Prior to joining Notre Dame, he practiced appellate and complex civil litigation at Jones Day here in Washington, D.C., having previously served as a law clerk to Justice Samuel Alito of the U.S. Supreme Court and Justice Thomas B. Griffith of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Now completing his PhD in philosophy at Princeton, he earned his JD at Yale Law School, a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and a bachelor's in philosophy from, you guessed it, Princeton. He is co-author with George and Anderson of What is Marriage, cited in a dissent in United States versus Windsor, and also an author of Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination. So with that, I will invite Melissa to begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and thanks to all the organizers of this conference. I'll begin, as many have, just by saying how honored I am to be here, and delighted to be able to pay tribute to Ravi, who has been such an inspiration to me both professionally and personally, and to whom I am deeply indebted, both for my understanding of natural law and human flourishing, and for his modeling of what it means to be a teacher and to pursue the truth and speak the truth with courage, and so it's wonderful to be able to be here today for this conference. So we are speaking here about making men moral, where Professor George defends the legitimacy of laws designed to uphold public morality. And when writing the book, he was worried about liberal critics who thought that morals laws were in principle unjust. When that book was written, he could presume broad agreement about the importance of the civil liberties that he defends in the last chapter of the book. And so the aim at that point was not really to mount a robust defense of those civil liberties against critics, but rather to show that his perfectionist natural law account could ground those civil liberties and limited government more broadly, at least as well as, and arguably better than, the anti-perfectionist liberal accounts of his intellectual opponents. Ironically, though, it now seems that the situation has radically flipped, and that what needs to be defended today is not so much the legitimacy of morals laws, but rather the very commitment to civil liberties and limited government that could largely be taken for granted when the book was written, a commitment that now is being challenged by progressives on the left and integralists and others on the right. So in my remarks today, I want to show that the natural law account presented in Making Men Moral is capable of defending civil liberties and limited government in the face of these challenges from right and left, and that this account can do so in a way that is more robust than liberal accounts, precisely because it's based on a substantive vision of human flourishing. Now, to do this, I want to illustrate these challenges to civil liberties by way of two examples. So the first example is the Mortara case, which is an example of the integralist challenge to civil liberties. Now, in brief, what happened in the Mortara case is that Edgardo Mortara, a Jewish boy born in 1851 in the Papal States, was secretly baptized by his Catholic nanny when he was in danger of death. And at a certain point, civil authorities, which were also papal authorities, caught wind of this. And so Pope Pius IX ordered that 7-year-old Edgardo be forcibly taken from his parents to receive the Catholic education that was his right. And integralists have recently defended the Pope's actions as completely justified, arguing that, in this case, the Pope was the legitimate civil ruler and that civil rulers have a right to take children away from their parents when it's in the best interests of the child. And in this case, they argue it was indeed in Edgardo's best interests to receive the Catholic education that aligned with his Catholic identity. Now, the rise of integralism, I think, is clearly a reaction against, at least in part, contemporary progressivism's own version of integralism, right? Its own lack of respect for civil liberties and limited government when advancing its own quite different, sometimes diametrically opposite, moral vision. I could give many examples of this, but here I focus on one example that bears striking resemblance to the Mortara case, namely the attempts of contemporary progressives to enable children who identify as transgender to undergo social transition and begin hormone therapies without parental knowledge or consent, and even to justify the removal of such children from the homes of loving parents who persist in opposing such interventions. Just as the integralists defend taking Edgardo from his parents in order to promote his good and his identity as they understand it, so too do contemporary progressives defend overriding parental judgments and sometimes even terminating custody in the name of promoting the good and identity of children as they understand it. This can be seen, for instance, in a recent California law that allows the state to take temporary emergency custody of minors who travel to California seeking quote-unquote gender-affirming care against the wishes of their parents. And also can be seen in many articles by prominent medical ethicists and legal scholars who advocate enabling children to undergo social and medical gender transition without parents' knowledge or consent, even if the only way to do this is to terminate the custody of parents whom they recognize would otherwise be considered loving, responsible, and quite capable of raising their children. I think that the natural law perspective outlined in Making Men Moral can provide strong, principled reasons, based on a substantive view of human flourishing, for rejecting the violations of civil liberties, and especially in these cases, parental rights, that both integralists and progressives seek to justify. Now, a little background on this natural law perspective. So according to the view that is defended in the book, morality is about respecting and promoting human flourishing, the integral flourishing of human persons, both as individuals and in community. The basic dimensions of human flourishing, things like life and health, knowledge, integrity, friendship, religion, and so on, are basic human goods. And the standard for morally upright action is the ideal of integral human flourishing, the flourishing of all human beings with respect to all of the basic goods in a harmonious community. Now, this ideal can be fleshed out in intermediate moral norms like the prohibition on intentional harm to basic goods, from which we get familiar moral rules like rules against murder or rape or torture or adultery, as well as norms forbidding arbitrary prioritization of one good over another or one person over another, norms like the Golden Rule, or the requirement to establish a reasonable order of priorities on the basis of one's vocational commitments and other obligations in life. Now, these basic principles might seem very abstract, but in fact, they provide the very foundation for thinking about politics and law. The moral imperative to promote integral human fulfillment, combined with the fact that human beings can only flourish in community, and that subpolitical communities, like the family and civic associations, as central as they are to human flourishing, are not self-sufficient for human flourishing. They can't meet the full range of human needs on their own. This is the basic justification for political community and political authority. And in Chapter 1 of Making Men Moral, Professor George argues that because moral virtue is central to human flourishing, and because subpolitical communities like the family on their own can't adequately protect and promote moral virtue without the help of law and government to maintain a healthy moral ecology, promoting public morality is among the legitimate purposes of political authority. At the same time, however, he notes that there are inherent limits on the government's ability to make men moral, and thus limits on the legitimate use of government power, and that these limits are grounded precisely on the requirements of human flourishing. One of these limits relates to the wide variety of human goods that are constitutive of human flourishing. There is, George writes, no single pattern anyone can identify as the proper model of a human life, not because there's no such thing as good and bad, but because there are many goods. And this means that any given person can reasonably choose to organize his or her life around a variety of valuable commitments. For a young person, say, choosing among various career possibilities, there is usually no single right answer. And so the government is not competent to determine which vocational path a person ought to pursue. Vocational discernment includes both objective and subjective factors, and it requires intimate knowledge of a person's capacities and inclinations and circumstances. And once a set of vocational commitments that organize one's life has been made, those commitments will determine many of one's day-to-day moral responsibilities. But because laws are general, and many, if not most, of our moral obligations are vocation-specific, only a very small range of moral obligations are in fact suitable for legal enforcement. More importantly, though, George argues that, quote, people are fulfilled in part by deliberating and choosing for themselves a pattern of their own for their lives. In other words, what he's getting at is that the perfection of our practical reasoning capacities through the exercise of our own agency is a fundamental aspect of our flourishing. And so even in the highly unlikely hypothetical scenario in which the government could consistently make better judgments about what I ought to do than I could, the government can never deliberate, choose, and act for me. Government can never replace my own exercise of agency, my own acts of will, through which I make myself a certain sort of person, ideally a person who is open to that ideal of integral human flourishing. And so the natural law view that George espouses recognizes that the exercise of agency in freely pursuing goods and organizing one's life in line with one's commitments and obligations is part and parcel of human flourishing. And this implies that a government concerned with promoting human flourishing, including moral virtue, will have to be a government that generally respects people's freedom to direct their own lives in accordance with their own choices and obligations. As George notes, a government that seeks to promote virtue, quote, will therefore seek to maintain and secure a moral ecology that is inhospitable not only to such vices as pornography, prostitution, and drug abuse, but also the vices of moral infantilism, conformism, servility, mindless obedience to authority, and hypocrisy. And so civil liberties must be respected not in spite of, but precisely because of the government's concern with the promotion of human flourishing. Further, and here you'll see the connection to parental rights, which is the specific civil liberty at issue in the cases I discussed at the outset, the exercise of agency in the pursuit of goods and in the fulfillment of one's vocational obligations is not simply an individual matter, but has an irreducibly social dimension. Indeed, among the basic goods that contribute to our flourishing is the good of marriage, which is intrinsically oriented to family life, including, crucially, the procreation and education of children. For the family community to be able to flourish, it needs freedom from government intrusion into its internal affairs. And so George argues that a morally good political society would invade the privacy of the family only out of exigent need, such as a need to stop the neglect or abuse of a child. Another requirement of respect for the good of marriage and family is respect for the parental decision-making authority, which is the flip side of parents' natural obligations to care for their children. Because, given children's immaturity, one can't properly care for children without making decisions on their behalf, and so without exercising authority over them. George cites Aquinas in recognizing that because parents' natural obligations to raise and educate their children, because of those obligations, it would be contrary to natural justice to remove children from their parents' custody, or, Aquinas says, to do anything to them against their parents' wishes. And since the fulfillment of parental obligations is also a central element in many people's vocational obligations, respecting parental rights is also crucial to enabling people to exercise their agency in the fulfillment of their obligations, and thus to grow in moral virtue. Now, of course, respect for parental rights means nothing if it doesn't mean respecting the right of parents to make decisions that the government disagrees with. And so it has to include things like the right of Edgardo Mortara's parents to continue to educate him in the religious tradition that they believe to be true, despite the government's disagreements, or the rights of parents today with children who identify as transgender to decide on how to care for their children, even in the face of quote-unquote experts who believe that the only appropriate response is what they call gender-affirming care. So for the natural law view, state intervention into the family should be limited to those cases of exigent need that George mentions, cases of genuine abuse and neglect. I say genuine here because this is often, unfortunately, ideologically defined, or cases where there's a clear threat to the public order. In sum, I think George's view can explain why a government concerned with making men moral ought to respect civil liberties, including parental rights. And it does so in a way that can help us to more robustly defend civil liberties against today's challenges. For integralism and progressivism are both unabashedly moralistic in their own way. And so bland appeals to a kind of liberal neutrality, I think, have already proven sufficient to counter them. What we need instead is a rival account that shows us why human flourishing is better promoted by respecting civil liberties than by overriding them. And this is precisely what Making Men Moral provides us.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to participate in recognizing the importance of Professor George's work. The book was formative for me and something I still use in my teaching. More importantly, Professor George has been a singular influence in my life, and it's a real honor for me to be able to pay tribute to him in this small way. I think if you gave me the entire day here on stage, I wouldn't have enough time to say everything I would need to say about Professor George. And if you did give me the entire day, I would actually want to spend that time saying hello to everyone in the room because of the amazing group of people who are here to surround and celebrate him. I'm going to refer to the view advanced in Making Men Moral as conservatism, mainly for brevity, but also rhetorically. In my opening remarks, I'd like to address three charges made, especially by critics on the right, against the view in Making Men Moral. And in the interest of time, I'll get right to it. The first charge is that conservatism collapses into liberalism in the sense of a pro-neutrality anti-perfectionism, where neutrality refers to neutrality between competing conceptions of the good. The view here is that, despite being explicitly perfectionist, conservatism is ultimately too pluralistic and lacks the philosophical resources to defend a vision of the good and therefore the common good. The second charge is that even insofar as conservatism does not collapse into pro-neutrality, anti-perfectionist liberalism, it is inadequate to the present moment because it doesn't underwrite pursuit and exercise of power in the unrestrained way that opponents on the left pursue and exercise power. The third charge, closely related to the second, is that even insofar as conservatism does not collapse into pro-neutrality, anti-perfectionist liberalism, and even insofar as it is theoretically adequate to the present moment, it is naive about what is necessary for the fight we are in today. This suggests not an in-principle rejection of conservatism, but a defect in conservatism's prudential judgment. Alternatively, the charge may be one not of naivete, but instead of squeamishness about the exercise of power, which can appear to be a failure to recognize the need for its use. With respect to the first charge, that conservatism collapses into liberalism, the main thing to say, as the people in this room probably know, is that the whole book is a rebuke to this view. This might seem elementary, but the post-liberal critique is largely based on conflating conservatism with liberalism of this sort. Among my students, who are decidedly not post-liberal critics of conservatism, I see the pro-neutrality, anti-perfectionist air they breathe is so thick that they take on liberal assumptions without so much as an awareness of the internal contradictions it generates in their own thought. They're both pro-neutrality and extremely dogmatic in their wokeness, of course, let alone an awareness of the substantive counter-arguments to the anti-perfectionism. So perhaps the cognitive dominance of liberalism that liberalism enjoys helps to explain why post-liberals mistakenly see it wherever they look. In contrast, the second charge, that conservatism imposes institutional restraints even in the face of opponents who disregard civil liberties and the like, has some truth to it. Conservatism is emphatically not consequentialist. There are exceptionalist norms that get in the way of winning at all costs. In a way, this is also an elementary point, but one should not underestimate how much traction this charge has on the new right. For those attracted to that view, which includes a lot of young people on the right, it is worth asking what the world will be like after winning at all costs, or, to coin a phrase, what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? People in the room know what the exact reference for that is, I think, but there's... That's a critical point and a nice piece of rhetoric. I'm not getting in the middle of the Catholics and the Protestants. You do your own thing. And...
So you quoted Jewish.
Yeah. You're welcome. That's a critical point about not winning at all costs and a nice piece of rhetoric, but it also resonates with an argument at the heart of conservatism. You know, I just did that, and I have to just digress to say I didn't want to go overly long in the remarks, but just the other on yesterday, teaching in class, I realized again, which is something I realized actually my first year of high school teaching, that even my mannerisms as I teach in class mimic Professor George. I mean, obviously my thinking and my vocabulary and everything that, but literally I do the same hand motion sometimes, and it's I take it as encouragement, not embarrassment. So the point about not winning at all costs resonates with an argument at the heart of conservatism. The conservative understanding of rights, which has now already been mentioned so well, which Professor George articulated in Making Men Moral, but which bears repeating and amplifying, is that rights protect goods, and that rights deserve protection insofar as they protect those goods. Just like the fight is not worth winning if it leaves us with a world not worth living in, the attainment and exercise of power in the defense of rights is not worthwhile if it destroys the very goods that justify those rights. Or at least, in a nod to the possibility that some do not wish to defend rights per se, conservatives can answer that the defense of reflexive goods without the defense of rights is also empty, because those goods cannot be realized without the rights that make their instantiation possible. Regarding the third charge, that conservatism is naive about the need for power or squeamish about its use, the only rebuttal is a demonstration that conservatism's conclusions are supported by sound prudential judgments. That's where I think the action is, and that's what I'd like to press here. My aim, and apologize in advance, is not to render any verdicts, but instead to frame some of the questions confronting those of us who want to carry on Professor George's work today. I actually find it amazing how in the book, Professor George makes the arguments that are the center of his efforts 30 years later. This is a testament both to the enduring nature of truth and to Professor George's political vision. I'm going to use the example of free speech, which is fitting because, for those who have been following, Professor George is one of its leading champions. In Making Men Moral, the outline of the argument, briefly, is that free speech is necessary not only for, but specifically for, the good of knowledge, the good of friendship, and for the common good, because officials need to know the thoughts and feelings of all the people in order to take them into account. Valueless speech, however, is not, in principle, entitled to protection. Professor George writes, quote, this from the book, "Speech that fails to advance any human good is valueless, for the value of speech is instrumental, not intrinsic. By the same token, not all speech that enables people to cooperate is valuable, for people can cooperate for evil purposes as well as for good ones. Thugs cooperate to rob the defenseless. Unscrupulous businessmen cooperate to fix prices. Neo-Nazis cooperate to march through Jewish neighborhoods. Speech is valuable when it makes possible valuable cooperation, and cooperation is valuable when it is for the sake of worthy ends." End quote. So this is rights, protect goods. Extending protection to valueless speech is the work of prudence. To pick up Professor George's example from the book, What does prudence tell us about neo-Nazis marching in Skokie, Illinois? This seems particularly relevant given the current outburst of anti-Semitism in this country and elsewhere. Witnessing these events, conservatism's friends want to know whether pluralistic perfectionism takes us too far in what it counts as valuable speech. And if it does not take us too far in principle, then what about in practice? Are conservatism's prudential judgments too permissive? This is a question that can be broken into parts. Primarily, per the subject of the book, we are asking about government regulation. But prudential judgments concerning private entities are related, or at least similar. How should corporations, universities, and the rest respond? And among private institutions, do certain institutions, by virtue of their missions, have special responsibilities? And if so, what are they? Do educational institutions, for example, have a special responsibility to promote free speech in all cases, or to teach the truth as they see it? What about law firms? Should Davis Polk rescind job offers to Hamas sympathizers? And what about persons in their private capacities? Should I rescind Thanksgiving, or perhaps in this context, Shabbat dinner invitations? Here, in an abridged version, are a couple of thoughts from Professor George, from his latest work, the site formerly known as Twitter. First, quote, 31 Harvard organizations have declared that, have declared that the murders, rapes, kidnappings, and other atrocities committed by Hamas against innocent people are in no way the fault of Hamas, but are rather entirely the fault of Israel. Something is deeply, deeply wrong in academia. So I'm still quoting. Some are asking Harvard to censor or act against these groups or make a statement of some sort denouncing them. This is a mistake. It would compromise freedoms that are important, even though they can be abused, and would harm rather than help in the effort to reform higher ed. So that's one example of Professor George's prudential judgment in this arena, and one more. And second, in trying to refer to the example I brought up before, and second, in trying to police campus speech, whether by formal or informal mechanisms, beware the law of unintended consequences. Should we cheer the decision of Davis Polk to rescind law job offers to students associated with groups whose statements conflict with the firm's values? What happens next? Firms will be pressured to do the same to students who belong to pro-life groups. Socially liberal advocacy groups are immensely powerful, and law firms and large corporations are extremely vulnerable to pressure from them. It's not an open question or a matter of speculation whether large law and business firms are vulnerable to pressure from socially liberal advocacy groups. Such firms have capitulated to these groups time and time again. Just ask Paul Clement, end quote. Thus, prudence dictates that governments should not restrict such speech even when it may, and that universities and firms should not condemn it, much less restrict it. No doubt Professor George is right that the power to cancel, if unleashed, will be used against conservatives more than by conservatives. Critics will say that the other side is going to cancel us anyway, indeed they already are, so why not cancel them when we have the chance? Better critics will say that silence on the matter, failure to speak and act with moral clarity and conviction, allows evil to fester until a small, manageable problem becomes a big, unmanageable one. If these points do not defeat the prudential reasons for restraining from restriction and condemnation, then it is upon those of us who, and I count myself among us, those of us who wish to continue Professor George's work to say why with equal moral clarity and conviction. While making men moral cannot and should not provide the answers for every judgment call, one of its many virtues is that it sets these questions before us with rigor and purpose. It equips us by proposing sound principles and also by distinguishing principle from prudence. This is indispensable for our civic discourse as well as for our classroom education. I hope we can do justice to this achievement as we carry the work forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to the organizers for bringing me here. I'm obviously super thrilled to be honoring Professor George. You could look at my life and think that he's shaped me more than anybody besides my mom and my dad, and I'd hope you'd be able to add Jesus Christ. And other than that, there's no close fourth to Robbie. And it's true that from my high school graduation onward, every good thing that's happened to me has been the result of a tag team operation between Robbie, George, and God. So I'm very grateful for all of that. But I'm going to start in a way that might seem ungrateful, but I know that he would actually welcome, which is with a critique. And then I'll work my way around to what I think is the most important thing that I'm indebted to him for and that many of us are. The critique involves free speech as well in the same passages that Danielle was talking about. And it's simply this. I think there's a gap, if not maybe a gulf, between the arguments he makes about free speech at the end of the book and his absolutism about free speech in real life. So as Danielle was mentioning, the book says about free speech that, first of all, speech is not intrinsically valuable, has no inherent worth. Second, that it is instrumental to the good of knowledge, but of course for a belief to constitute knowledge, it has to be true. And third, that it's instrumental to the good of cooperation, but for cooperation to be valuable, it has to be in the pursuit of worthy ends. Which makes it seem like if a belief is false and pernicious, it doesn't have any inherent value, so there'd be nothing in principle wrong with banning it. And of course, you might, in the effort to ban the bad speech, sweep in some good speech as well, and that is a cost. But of course, there are costs on the other side with too much free speech because some speech is pernicious. And Robbie George himself, in the same chapter, tells you that the costs and benefits are incommensurable, that people can draw the lines in different ways because the common good is complex and you can restrict rights like speech in the pursuit of the common good. So I was reading this and I was thinking, I don't really know the way out, and I'm pulling up a quote here because, of course, what I did at that point is what I often do when I don't know how to finish an essay, which is I went to distract myself on Twitter. And when I did, I came across a clip, by dumb luck or providence, a clip of a senator in Ireland, Pauline O'Reilly, speaking in defense of what strikes many of us as a draconian anti-free speech bill, a hate speech bill. And here's what she said in defense of it. When you think about it, all law, I can hear the Irish brogue starting. I'm going to try to avoid that. All legislation is about the restriction of freedom. That's exactly what we're doing here, is we are restricting freedom, but we're doing it for the common good. Yes, you have rights, but they are restricted for the common good. Everything needs to be balanced. And if your views on other people's identities go to make their lives unsafe and secure and cause them such deep discomfort that they cannot live in peace, then I think it is our job as legislatures to restrict those freedoms for the common good. And so that sounds like thank you for that. Sounds like chapter 7 of Making Men Moral is not an obstacle. It's not an obstacle to Pauline O'Reilly. It's equipping her with everything she needs. Why not? Yesterday, for 2 minutes, Professor George gave you, at the end of one of the panels, his argument for why he can and should be an absolutist about free speech. And as often happens, I was completely bewitched and beguiled for it for about 2 minutes, and then I came to think it was wrong. And I can tell you both the Steelman version and why I think it's wrong in the Q&A if you want. But all of this led me to think, well, I better make the talk about something else. And so I thought about his defense of absolutism about free speech in the academic context. He has been a valiant defender of free speech. He endorses the Chicago principles, which say that universities, even private universities, have to allow their faculty and students to express views, however vile. And the Calvin Report, which says that universities and administrators should not take views on issues, however morally urgent and important and powerful. What explains that kind of absolutism? The first thought I had about that is that actually at the end of the day, he's not an absolutist about free speech from private universities because he's fine with religious universities. He's very happy for Liberty University to say that if you want to come here, you have to subscribe to the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so I think he would say that in principle, there's nothing wrong with a liberal university saying if you want to come here, you have to subscribe to the Gospels of Sanger, Hume, Mill, and Rawls. But the reason he wants Princeton and places like Princeton to embrace the Chicago principles in the Calvin Report is that they haven't done that, and they never would do that. None of them would admit, you're not welcome here if you're evangelical, the way that Liberty says you're not welcome here unless you're evangelical. And so if they have made a commitment to be non-sectarian, then they have to keep the commitment. And you do have obligations to keep commitments even when there are side costs. But that's only really true if the commitment itself makes sense to make in the first place, if it serves some distinctive good. So the question is, what good does that commitment serve? Now, he usually says the pursuit of knowledge and the truth, and the spread of the truth. And at this point, his critics from the right on free speech will say, aha, we've got you exactly where we want you, because this depends on the absurdly optimistic Millian premise that in a free marketplace of ideas, the truth always outs. And you don't have to spend a lot of time on social media and see the misinformation and disinformation and so on to see that that's not true. We have no empirical support for it. We have plenty of empirical arguments against it. So why think that free speech in the academy would be any different? And I think he's not relying on that Millian empirical premise. He's actually relying on two philosophical premises. One of them is the thought that even if the spread of ideas, even if free inquiry did not lead more people to arrive at the truth, it would lead those who do arrive at the truth to a deeper appropriation of it. That if you come to believe the truth in the teeth of the counter-arguments, in the teeth of the best counter-arguments, A, your grasp on it will be more robust, will be likelier to survive collisions with counter-arguments in the future. And B, your participation in the good of knowledge will be deeper and richer than it would be if you had come to believe the same exact truth based on taking a pill or listening to your elders. So that's the first premise. And the second reason to think that universities can accomplish a distinctive good by signing on to freedom of speech is that, this does now sound a little bit Millian, but it's quite different, I think, which is that the truth does win out under ideal epistemic conditions. When the conditions are right, when the fight is fair, the truth will tend to win. And what are the ideal epistemic conditions? Well, I think you can get a hint of what he thinks they are from looking at how he conducts his class. And I think they also got their first and very best expression in the dialogue that made him a teacher in the first place, which is the Gorgias, which he mentioned yesterday, which I like to think is Greek for George, but I doubt. I think Joshua Katz is shaking his head. It's probably Gorgios for George and for Gergis, in fact, which just means George. And Gorgias is different, but it has shaped him tremendously. So what are those conditions? Finis, Robbie's teacher and mine, has an essay called Natural Law and the Ethics of Discourse where he lays them out. And here's the first one. Robust freedom of speech. In fact, one of the first things that I'm so self-conscious with Joshua Katz watching me talk about this, but one of the very first things that Socrates says to Gorgias and Poulos and the other interlocutors is, it's great that we're here in Athens, this is a direct quote, in Athens where the freedom of speech is greater than anywhere else in Greece, which for them means anywhere else in the world. So that's the very first condition. That's not, some liberal villain like John Stuart Mill or Oliver Wendell Holmes. That's the godfather of classical and Western thinking, Socrates by way of Plato. Number two, ideal epistemic conditions for pursuing the truth is that you have to have leisure. You have to have a certain kind of distance from practical constraints and limitations that might force you either to cut the argument short because some action needs to be taken, or to embrace a conclusion based on something other than the force of the arguments through motivated reasoning. And the third thing, relatedly, is that you have to have the right motives. You have to love at least one thing more than winning, which is the truth. And ideally, you would also love your interlocutor as you love yourself. Because only then do you have the psychological freedom to come around to his view if he makes a good argument without experiencing that as a kind of threat or defeat to your self-image in a kind of zero-sum game. If you love each other and both love the truth, then when either person budges on an issue, it's actually a victory for both and for the one thing you care about. And those are exactly the kinds of conditions that Robbie George does, in fact, foster in his classes. He relishes, he runs toward, not away from, whatever he regards as the very best counter-arguments to what you know, in fact, secretly he thinks, even though he's not making it the issue in the class. He relishes and cherishes the presence of people with different enough ideas that they can both make those arguments as powerfully as possible in real time. And the one thing he is grimly strict about is that every view, no matter how outrageous it might strike somebody in the class, can be made if it can be defended with an argument. And he thinks, I suspect, that the reason that some universities can and some universities should make the commitment to free speech is to approximate those conditions, to use their leisure and their freedom and their resources and their insulation from practical constraints and urgencies to create ideal epistemic conditions under which people, other things equal, will come closer to the truth. So now you might ask, well, how has that worked out for him? And some of his critics on this issue are Catholics and conservatives who think that actually if he's a responsible conservative Catholic, he should be trying to make his students Catholic and conservative. And I actually think that's not what he takes to be the organizing goal of the classroom, and I agree with him on that. But if it were, I can't believe that he would have a better record than he in fact does. Because I've met countless people in all walks of life who it turns out had Robbie George for a seminar or a class. Scott Stewart, the SG of Mississippi, who had the courage and the foresight to ask the court to overturn Roe v. Wade, is just one of many, many recent examples, who said that they were changed on politics or on religion in the direction that Robbie's Catholic conservative critics would be happy about as a result of these classroom conditions where I can tell you firsthand, he makes excruciatingly, distressingly powerful arguments for the opposite views. Second, I think he would say, if you're not impressed by that kind of anecdotal evidence, and it is very anecdotal, you have to at least be open to the idea that under the right conditions, the truth wins out. In fact, if you don't believe that, then in what sense do you believe that our reason is even somewhat reliable? I mean, yes, it's darkened and it's misshapen, but it is still intact, contra Pastor Calvin. And if you don't think it's intact, if you think our reason is completely unreliable, then maybe you should spend less time making reasoned arguments against his view about free speech, because reason can't get us anywhere. And I think ultimately, if you said, well, I don't know about the anecdotal evidence, and I'm kind of Calvinist, so I don't know about the idea that reason is at least somewhat reliable, at least under the ideal conditions, I think Robbie would say, and here I agree with him, that it is at least reasonable to hope, and in fact, to wager all your teaching and all your scholarship and a whole career on the wager that the truth is luminous, that it does outshine its rivals, that we can approximate the ideal epistemic conditions, and that some of us do have an obligation and the vocation to spend a lifetime trying. So it's for inducting me into that way of life and that vocation and that obligation, and so many of us, that I think we owe him the greatest debt of gratitude. Thank you.
Wonderful. That was really wonderful. Thank you. I have a question for each of you, but feel free to chime in, even if it's directed at one person. I'll start with you, Sharif. You sort of previewed the talk that you decided not to give, right, and shifted to the academy. But I wonder if you can take us back to the political context, right? I mean, I suspect outside of Professor George's classroom and a few others, even the academy doesn't provide the conditions, the epistemic conditions you described, but certainly political discourse and public discourse doesn't. But what hopefulness might we still have for free speech in the political context?
Yeah, I do think we have an obligation to at least try. So if you notice the three conditions, one of them can't be realized outside something like the insulation of the academy, which is the kind of leisure and freedom from practical constraints and the need to make an immediate decision and the temptation to make it based on something other than the truth and so on, that universities don't achieve, but at least have the opportunity and resources to try to approximate. You can't realize that in political life generally because it's the world of action and decision. There's another condition that you can't realize either in politics or in the academy. It just has to be it's on each person to bring it or not, which is the right motivations. At least as a teacher, you can model the right motivations. You can try to encourage and coach people in that direction. But your ability to do that is not complete, and it's certainly much less in the public square in general. But I think the kind of freedom to make different arguments, and then ultimately the ability to provide forums for people to make them, so that there are at least other islands of decent forums for speech and discussion, is one that at least a deliberative democracy has an obligation to do. So one way that liberal democracies that can do that is through their public universities and through the attempt to pepper the country with little institutions that are trying to do that locally here and there on different issues. I think another thing is with respect to elections and so on, to try to sponsor and create forums where there are decent and serious debates on the issues of the day, the issues that have to be decided. So some of the conditions can be replicated, and those that can be, I think we should try.
Can you think of examples of either of those, the public universities or the forums you mentioned?
You mean that are doing it right?
Yeah.
No. So I do think there are some public universities that are, there have been public university presidents, for example, that have fought back against attempts to punish or fire or otherwise exclude faculty or students based on their speech. I look at old videos of political debates. Now, these are usually sponsored by the parties and not by the government, but I don't think there's any reason in principle they couldn't be sponsored by the government, where without an audience and with a set of simple ground rules for the discussion and with fewer people on the stage, the ability to go deep into particular issues and to hear the full case made on each side is greater than it is in other settings. I think bringing back some firing line type institution, but it could be sponsored by the state, would be valuable.
Either of you want to comment on that? All right, my question for Melissa. You mentioned these two cases, the Mortara case and then also the case of where the state is infringing on or even overriding a parent's wishes and their authority when the parents oppose so-called gender-affirming care. Of course, there's a third case, right, which involves parental rights of parents who wish to transition their children and sincerely believe that that's in their child's best interest, right, that constitutes flourishing for their child. And we have cases of parents challenging bans on gender treatment for minors based on the argument that they violate their fundamental liberty rights as parents to direct the care and upbringing of their children. So may the law infringe on their parental rights in such cases? And if so, how can making men moral in the argument help us to kind of distinguish among those three cases?
Right, so a few things to say. So first, I think it's really important to distinguish, on the one hand, between the state's public health authority to protect people from medical quackery, from procedures that are being offered or that certain medical doctors or institutions want to offer that perhaps lack sufficient evidence to ground their efficacy or their safety. And the state has long played a role in doing things like regulate which drugs are available on the market, which treatments can be offered by doctors or other medical institutions. And so nobody, right, no adult even has the right to go to a doctor and say, well, X procedure is illegal or X drug has not been approved to be given to the public, but I claim a right to receive this procedure or to get this drug, right? Nobody, even adult, has that right, and the state, I think, legitimately has a responsibility to look out for public health and protect people from medical malpractice or irresponsibility in that regard, and that's what states who have banned puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and mutilating surgeries for minors are doing, right? They're looking at the evidence and seeing that, in fact, there is no evidence to show significant or any, perhaps, benefits to these treatments and so-called treatments in the long run, and lots of evidence that they are quite harmful to health and even harmful to mental health in the long run, even though mental health is the purported justification for them. And they're following the lead of European countries like Finland and Sweden and the UK, which have recognized that, in fact, these are quite experimental and that the benefits of the treatments do not at all seem to be outweighing the risks and the costs. So that's a legitimate exercise of public health authority. It's totally different, however, for a state that has not decided to exercise that public health authority, where these treatments remain legal, and where many people in good faith think that it's the best or only way to help their children, and are being told by doctors and other people that they have reason to trust that these are the best treatments for their children. Parents in those circumstances should have the right to seek those treatments. And so if the state thinks that those treatments are in fact out of bounds, that parents are being misled, and that even perhaps some doctors are being misled about the usefulness of these sorts of treatments, then the state should outlaw the treatments, right? But in the situation where the treatments are legal, I think parental rights clearly include the right to choose in good faith a medical treatment that, on doctor's advice, you believe is in the best interest of your children, if that treatment is legal and available. So I don't think that treating that as child abuse, for instance, which some states have attempted to do, I think that that's wrong-headed. I mean, again, parental rights, if it means anything, means the right to choose among legally available medical treatments that doctors have advised as good for your children. So, I mean, a third thing, though, is that, on this issue in general, I think Making Men Moral gives us the lesson that on this issue and on many other contested issues, we can't retreat to a kind of the state should be a neutral arbiter, or we can't retreat from actually making the substantive arguments in the public square about what is, in fact, true and good for human beings. And so that ultimately on this issue, it has to be one on the substance of the fact that we are embodied beings, that male and female are biological realities, and that however real the suffering may be of people who feel deeply uncomfortable with the biological reality of their bodies is, that it simply can't be true that a child, or an adult for that matter, is in fact trapped in the wrong body, right? And so that it can't be true that changing the body is actually the solution to the problem, right? And so we have to just make that argument substantively, and that the good is to help that person integrate and be comfortable once again in their own skin and recognize the goodness of their body as it is, and deal with whatever the underlying psychological or other factors are that are leading them to fail to be comfortable within their own bodies.
Either of you want to comment on? No? Okay. Danielle, I have a question for you, which is inspired by the title of the panel, which, if anyone caught it, so the book subtitle is Civil Liberties and Public Morality, but our panel is Civil Liberties or Public Morality, right? Which suggests, as Ryan pointed out in the introduction yesterday, a tension, but which the book, and as Professor George said yesterday, the argument is that there is no tension if they're both properly understood. So I think the tension we observe comes from getting both wrong, right? On the one hand, despite what appears to be a pretty, this could be argued, but appears to be a fairly robust legal protection for the civil liberties Professor George endorses, we all stand amidst the wreckage, right, of a very imperfect, immoral culture, certainly characterized by a lack of communal virtue. So even though law by itself may not make men moral, it's supposed to help make men moral. It seems to be doing a pretty poor job, right? So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the widely held contemporary view of liberties is not that they are instrumental towards these intrinsic goods, but rather that they are detached from, intrinsic goods that they're meant to serve. So, why would prudence suggest that we should protect such a misguided view of liberty? And how, what's the path forward to achieving a kind of more robust, objective framework of moral ecology?
Right. Well, thank you. And it's a great question. I think it actually dovetails really well with the note that Melissa ended on in her last comment, which is that none of this can be done while prescinding from the underlying substantive questions about the good. And in fact, and it's not to say that, so on free speech, we don't care about the good or think about the good and just stay neutral, and then on gender-affirming care or these sorts of things we do. It's that there are specific reasons, and Sharif obviously discussed them extremely well, why we might want to protect speech without separating ourselves from, and in fact, in part because that is a way of protecting and enabling the underlying goods that it's related to, but without separating ourselves at all from articulating what the good and what the underlying goods are, right? So the problem is not that 30 years ago this book came out, everyone absorbed it deeply, legislated accordingly, and then somehow we ended up with the misright. It's that our polity took a completely different path where, as you were indicating, the liberties got separated from the goods. And this is why to continue on the theme of Professor George's work, right? The Making Men Moral, What is Marriage, which was co-authored, of course, with Ryan and Sharif, explains that you cannot answer the policy questions about this without answering the question, what is marriage? That there is a right way and a wrong way on a metaphysical level to understand what marriage is. And the substance of the matter will guide us in the legislation. And this will true for the biological realities of male and female. It's true about life and all the abortion and all the end of life questions as well, where we need to get that right. And so the problem. So in a way, there's two problems. One problem is either losing the argument or not making the argument on the substantive issues, and then also losing that meta-argument about the fact that civil liberties can't be understood outside the context of the substantive goods that they're related to. Fortunately, Making Men Moral is a corrective to all of this, which is why one day Professor George will convince the press to release it at a price lower than $100 a pop, and we can tell everybody to buy it. I would just say, if I don't lose my train of thought, on a further note, that this is also why this theme of law as teacher is so important, because the law, without restricting civil liberties, can also play an enormous role in pointing people toward the good. It's not an either-or on protecting the moral ecology, or in fact, the or in the subtitle, right? It is in fact not an either-or. Now, it may take a lot of good judgment to figure out just where that is, because as the other panelists have pointed out so well, it's very easy to slip into that either-or understanding and to think that we're choosing either between the moral ecology or civil liberties. And the last point is because I wanted to, taking from Professor George's exts about what law firms should do, and I don't know, we don't call them tweets anymore. So whatever the things are, right, from the about what Davis Polk should be doing, what universities should be doing, is that we don't want to forget subsidiarity and the enormous role of private institutions. Right? If we're just looking at the government to figure out how to protect civil liberties and protect public morality, we're in trouble anyway. Sharif's point about evangelization in the classroom, even subtle and subversive evangelization. Right? If Professor George not only has spiritual children, but also spiritual grandchildren, because all I do in the classroom is repeat what I've heard. I talk about natural law the way he taught me to talk about natural law, and I teach in that, best arguments on all sides, just in the way he taught me to teach. And sure enough, a few years ago, a student's walking out of the class and whispers to me on the way out, I want you to teach me to be conservative, he says, right? And sure enough, we go on this little journey together, and he graduates college and gets himself baptized, right, and so on. And so, and if I could do it, you guys better, right. But there's really a lesson there that, right, in two ways. One, to reject the idea that the government actually has to make a choice between civil liberties and public morality, but also to say that what is the, you ended the question with what is the path forward, and so I'll end my answer here. The path forward is to double down on evangelization in all the different ways that we can take that word, because at the end of the day, if we think that our civilization is going to be saved by government splitting the atom just right, then we're losing anyway. So just want to double down on we have to get the laws right, but we also have to do the rest of it.
Yeah, you sort of anticipated my last question, and we've got questions coming in from the online audience. So I'll just make this my last question, but to the panel. But I loved Ryan's personal question over lunch to the panelists, and so this is of a more personal nature. Each of you's followed Professor George in your vocation, right, as teacher. And so I wonder if you might comment sort of on two things. One, in your experience as a teacher, how well prepared, how well formed are your students to appreciate the arguments and making them moral? Or is there some sort of groundwork you need to lay first, right, in order to help them appreciate it and kind of steer them from the various misunderstandings they might be susceptible to? And then also, and this is the part maybe you already answered, but what did you learn from Professor George as a professor that guides you in forming your students? So I'll start with you, Sherry.
I'll start with the second thing. I think, just to pick up on the theme that's come up a couple times, I did learn that my responsibility, there's a role morality, right? There's a time and a place for everything, and so not all good things have to be attempted in every setting. And in the classroom, the role morality, the good that can be most distinctively realized in the classroom is teaching people to think critically and airing the best arguments and giving the truth a chance to do its thing. And in that context, I've really tried hard. And so I had a recent, last semester, I had a kind of opportunity to practice because I was teaching constitutional law 2, which is the fake side of con law, so rights and liberties. And I shouldn't have said that on tape. And I tried very hard to make the case. And, the students know that I've written on marriage and life and religious liberty and so on from a conservative perspective, but I tell them, if you had not Googled me before this class, my goal is that you would not know when you left the room what I thought about the issue. And one day, just to give you a concrete example, it was a Obergefell day. And so, students who were like leaders of the gay rights group sitting over here, and the Rad Trad Catholics sitting over there, and FEDSAC here and ACS there. And then they all know that I've written a lot about that issue, so the stakes are high. We have a good conversation because of the amazing atmosphere that my colleagues create at Notre Dame and the amazing students that we've got. And then about 5 minutes before class ends, someone says, well, what do you think is the best argument for Obergefell? I thought, all right, this is the testing moment. Am I Robbie or am I Les? And so I said, well, and then I made my pitch. Apparently it lasted like 5 minutes. And she told me afterward, she's socially liberal, those were the most powerful 5 minutes of law school I've ever experienced. And I immediately thought, well, you should have asked for the counter-argument too. But I don't think that, I wouldn't have been capable of doing that. B, I would not have seen it as a thing that it is desirable to do if I hadn't had the example of Robbie and, all the kind of background that I described in my talk.
Did you want to answer part 2 or?
I don't remember.
It was about your students' formation and sort of their susceptibility.
Yeah. Okay, the susceptibility.
Well
I don't teach a class where making men moral itself is kind of relevant. I'm teaching doctrinal classes, and but I will say this: when I took civil liberties from him, I was too chicken to take con interp, which I was told was graded even harder than civil liberties. But when I took civil liberties, which was about all the things that I'm now teaching in con law 2. One of the most important themes in the class was what is, in this high-stakes political settings where the legal sources are very thin, what is the legitimate role of an unelected judge in a liberal democracy seemingly making law on high matters of policy? And in that setting, to ask questions that were critical of the judge's role, that wanted a more limited role for the judge, sounded like a kind of conservative talking point, a hangover of opposition to the Warren and Burger courts, etc. Today, my students are more susceptible than my peers were at that time to hearing that argument because the political valences have flipped, because they perceive the judiciary as being in the hands of political conservatives. And so the stakes, which are exactly the same as they were at the time that I was learning them from Robbie in 2007, but the valences being flipped, they can appreciate them more easily.
So I'll also start with the second half of the question, and similar to Sharif, I think it's a faith in the power of the arguments to do their work once you've cleared the ground in various ways. And so I try as hard as I can, and my students probably hate it because it means they have to do twice the reading, to make sure that on every issue they're actually seeing what I take to be the best arguments on both sides. And what I find actually is quite interesting is that sometimes actually simply seeing the philosophically consistent arguments on the side that I think is wrong is enough to show the students the problems with the view, right? Because most of the arguments that students are being given about, say, abortion or assisted suicide or sexual ethics, for instance, that are just kind of out there on Twitter or in the public square are not actually philosophically rigorous and consistent. And so they stop short of their logical conclusions, right? But when I give them Peter Singer to read, and he unabashedly says, yeah, I mean, the same argument that grounds abortion grounds infanticide. Because if the unborn is not a person, because the unborn child can't, think or speak or do these person-like things that you and I can do, well, clearly neither is the infant. And so he agrees, place seems irrelevant, inside, outside the mother's body. What would that have to do with the dignity of the being in question? And so he just shows the logic. And I actually have a hard time trying to get the students to take it seriously and say, no, I'm not giving you a crazy straw man view. This is a Princeton professor. He's a serious philosopher. But he's showing you the logic of the argument and where it goes. And so they resist that, but insofar as they recognize that logic, it often then just does my work for me in terms of helping them see the problems with it. And similar things with other views on sexual ethics. I basically help them see, look, here are the most consistent views for a kind of sexual liberationist view where it is fine for sex to be just recreational, where there's no necessary connection between sex and marriage and procreation and so on. And that same view can't really explain why, for instance, rape is worse or different in kind from assault of a non-sexual kind. Because it can't explain why sex is special at all. Because if sex is special, then actually it follows that there are some special moral restrictions that go along with it. So I think, actually leaning into the arguments on the other side and helping them to see the logic in ways that public debates don't actually helps to clarify things in really important ways and teaches students to think more critically and to follow those arguments that they're seeing in the public square to their logical conclusions. On the kind of preconditions that students need to be able to appreciate these sorts of arguments, I think two sets of things that I try to do. One is I've taken to starting out my courses with some version of what Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff talk about in The Coddling of the American Mind as the three great untruths. And so I give students, they talk about these common untruths which have become so popular in our culture. The untruths being that first, your emotions are always right, right, and so they're a reliable guide to everything, right? If you want to know what's right and wrong, always trust your emotions. Second, that whatever doesn't kill me makes me weaker, the untruth of fragility. Which goes along with the idea that uncomfortable ideas are violence and are harmful, and I have to be protected from them. And then third, that the world is divided into good people and bad people. And if you want to know which ones they are, refer to the one about emotions telling you, right? And so, I kind of put these on the table, and the students recognize that this is kind of in the air. And I challenge them to say, okay, look, we're going to deal with really difficult issues in these courses. And so we need to, first of all, recognize that we're going to look at reason. And sure, emotions are not irrelevant, but our emotions depend on how we were educated and on what, the views in the air are. And so sometimes our emotions are not a reliable guide to what the truth is. And so there might be views that you hear that your initial instinct is a kind of emotional dislike of them, but the challenge is to not let that lead you to totally dismiss the argument, right? So it's a challenge to open-mindedness and to reasoning, and then also to recognize, something that Robbie always begins his classes with, as far as I can remember, which is that people genuinely pursuing the truth, even if they entirely disagree about the substance of the matter, have one thing in common, which is that common good of truth itself. And so, that we in the classroom should be sure never to kind of descend to those ad hominem attacks or just immediately kind of villainizing the people that disagree with us, even if we think they're dead wrong, right? Because if it's a good-natured attempt to get at the truth, then there is a common good that we share. And so I try to set the groundwork in that way for the students. And that's also, another way that Professor George has influenced me.
Would you like to add to your previous? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
So in answer specifically to the question, no, their students are absolutely not well prepared to encounter all this. And we do need to lay the groundwork. Now, fortunately, Professor George has, in fact, showed us the way. I really do believe that I have the advantage of not being famous, so they don't know what I think. But I believe that if I came in guns blazing about here's the truth and this is what you should think, I really think it just would be counterproductive. And instead, I do exactly what I learned from Professor George. As I said, I teach right down the middle, and they know. I mean, they must be sick of hearing me say it, but we're gonna encounter the best arguments on all sides. And I know I do a good job of this because I had I'm a good disciple because I had a student take 3 classes with me over the course of 2 semesters, and he was a very good student, got A's or A minuses in all the classes. Sorry, I give out A's. That's one thing I probably don't follow closely enough in. And after all of that, he came into my office during office hours and said, I'm trying to revive the college Democrats on campus. Would you be the faculty advisor? So I just took that. I wore that a little bit as a badge of honor that I had, in fact, learned well at Professor George's knee as far as not putting a thumb on the scale for one or the other. And yet this is the most useful tool I have because I let them encounter the contradictions themselves. So I will actually, doing this kind of material in class, there can be an essay question like, should the law regulate morality? And of course, if I give them an essay, right, I get the first stupid thought that comes into their head. Sorry, guys, if you're watching, but I told them this in person, which is, no, the law shouldn't regulate morality because people disagree and it's unfair. And then after grading a set of midterms and giving them back to class, it's like, I'm just going to get a roll of stickers that says, so, no laws, ? And just put that sticker on every single rate. And they see, and I tell them now, I said, your first thought is not your best one. I said, and if I can blow up your essay on my first question, you haven't done your work, right? You haven't addressed, because I show them right away. I said, well, don't we disagree on the tax rate? And don't we disagree, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the way that Professor George has shown of just confronting the best arguments on all sides is actually the first step for laying the groundwork for them to be able to receive the deeper substantive arguments. That not beating them over the head with it is actually is subversive because it is much more effective. And just as I had one student, in fact, say to me, I know we have to move on. We had one student say to me, she walked into class one day, she said, Dr. Mark, I'm really mad at you. And I said, why is that? She said, because I used to know what I think, and now I don't know what I think. And I really, again, that was the biggest, I told her at the time, I said, Hindley, that's the biggest compliment you could give me on a final point about how to prepare the groundwork in case this gives anybody else an idea. So last semester, for those who know about AI was mentioned, for those who know about ChatGPT, if anybody here is also a professor, your students are all using it to write their essays. Just be aware of that. I found out, and even though I knew about this and warned them, they were still using it in my class to write their essays. And so the age of the take-home essay in Dr. Mark's class is over. I don't do blue books precisely for the in-class essay precisely because I don't want their first. I don't want their first stupid thought. I tell them the whole semester to think things through and not just vomit out whatever comes to mind. And instead, now I have an entire army of students mimicking Professor George because I give them an essay question, they give the essay question to ChatGPT, and their graded assignment they have to hand in to me is the argument they've had with ChatGPT over its answer, going back and forth, submitting to me all the questions. So they have to be Socrates, they have to be Professor George, they have to be the gadfly and fight it through. And so I'm kind of wielding this new and problematic technology to train a generation, I hope, of Professor Georges, and hopefully in doing that they will actually encounter, and I found it to be much better than giving them essays. Hopefully they will, in doing that, be able to see exactly the thing that we are trying to show them in this way. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to read the first question, but we probably have questions in the audience as well. So I wonder if the panelists can speak to the differences among different civil liberties. Are the prudential judgments or principles allowing harmful speech and allowing harmful parental choices different? And how, on Professor George's view, should one make these distinctions?
Sure, I'll start. So, I think absolutely that both the principled and prudential arguments are going to be different for each of the civil liberties because they protect different goods, right? And so the special arguments for speech that Sharif so eloquently enumerated for us, right? Those are specific to the way that speech is instrumental to the good of truth, and the way that free speech, especially in particular contexts, is necessary for the good of truth and for a kind of deep understanding of and participation in the good of truth. And so, you're going to think differently about different liberties according to the different good. And, Professor George talks about how religious liberty is, in part, has its own argument because of the special nature of the good of religion and the impossibility to coerce religious acts, that a coerced religious act or an inauthentic religious act, even if not entirely coerced but pressured by, even a kind of social pressure, is actually not an instantiation of the good of religion. And so you're actually more likely to undermine that good than foster it by attempting to coerce religion. I think with parental rights, you have to give your own set of arguments, and I think the arguments are sort of one step removed. So they relate in part to the good of marriage and family that is being protected by protecting the kind of internal sphere of the family, which includes parental decision-making. But I think in part the parental rights argument is jurisdictional in the sense that and relates to the principle of subsidiarity that was discussed in a previous panel, where there's a recognition that the society of the family is a family that has its own natural structure that is based on the good of marriage, but also on the particular needs of children that can only be fully and ideally met if they're raised in an intact family by their married biological parents. The only scenario in which they will know the intact and united love of both of the people that brought them into being, and so have the fullest kind of understanding of who they are and where they came from. And so that corresponds to deep needs that children have in a way that no other structure for raising children does. And so that is a structure that needs to be protected in and of itself. It's a structure that the state didn't create, but it's a structure that comes with its own authority, precisely because for parents to fulfill those special obligations that they have to their children, they have to have a certain degree of authority to make decisions on their children's behalf, such that the state, the state's authority over children is really indirect, mediated through the authority of the parents, analogous to the way in which, say, my relationship to the United Nations would be mediated through my U.S. citizenship. Obviously not the same, but it's a kind of nested levels of authority. And so there are systemic arguments for keeping the state out of parental decision-making, except in really egregious scenarios where it's clear that parents are utterly failing in fulfilling their obligations through neglect or abuse, right? And again, in situations where neglect and abuse are not defined ideologically.
Any questions from the audience?
Well, I'll try to make this quick, but I guess this would be maybe for Sharif and possibly, well, all of you. That one of the terms that Robert George uses in his work a lot is proper currency and reasonable people of goodwill. And I wonder if you would reflect that. To me, that strikes me sometimes as a little problematic and troubling, because not everybody is a PhD Princeton student. And some
as I am forever. Go ahead.
Oh, well, some unreasonable people can make good points, and if you also, for example, he often cites, and Melissa cited Peter Singer, and if Peter Singer makes evil points, but he does it in a slick and brilliant or facile way, is that a good example to set? And also, one more thing is that you're not. Robert George says, "Well, we don't want him fired." Well, you don't have. Why? His speech is not being restricted. It's just saying, should you have a privileged platform? He can shout it from the housetops, but does he have to do it from Princeton University? That's my question.
Okay, good. So there are a lot of elements there. So one, we have to separate the questions out. So one question is, can you find ideas that are worth reflecting on, if only to think about why they're wrong, from good as well as bad people? And the answer is yes. You can read works written by vile human beings and have material there for the kind of reflection that can bring you closer to the truth, if only by giving you more understanding of why this falsehood is false. A different question is who it's worth having at the table in a real-life discussion. And that's where the goodwill part starts to matter more. Because if the person in a conversation with you is only trying to score points or please an audience or get ahead, if they are making points with the goal of shutting down further discussion and blocking avenues for reflection instead of the opposite, then it's not actually going to produce the thing that a conversation in these kinds of settings is supposed to produce. So bad will, okay for being a source for interesting ideas, maybe. Bad will, not okay for being a worthy interlocutor, somebody to spend your finite time having a conversation with. On the point about platforms, I think, again, there are very fine distinctions, and Notre Dame is going to draw those in different ways than Princeton and so on. But one general way to think about it is that it's not enough for ideas, even if they're assuming that it's worth being able to engage with and seriously consider and feel, sweat a little bit under the force of bad arguments, assuming that that's true at all for the kinds of better appropriation of the truth type reasons I was describing earlier. Then there's also at least some reason for at least someone somewhere to provide people who hold that view the leisure and the time and the resources to make it as powerfully as possible. If we said, the views that we don't like, of course they get freedom to roam around and to provide us, some passing description of a view that we might want to do more with. But we'll never give them a platform. We'll never give them money. We'll never give them the time and resources to really develop the argument. Then we're still depriving ourselves to some extent of whatever goods are supposed to come from powerfully engaging even false ideas.
With apologies, we are already out of time, so please join me in thanking the panel.